Well, hi everyone. Yeah, it's a real joy to be here tonight, and actually to be able to spend a week with these lovely churches and this lovely community. And this evening is for everyone. For everyone. It's so whether you come here full of questions, or full of doubts, or full of faith, or full of skepticism, everyone here is most welcome. And I want to kind of make that like a rule as well. So on these kind of evenings, I find it's helpful to have 4 rules, and they're very simple. One is that we make no starting assumptions. So as I speak, I'm not going to be making any assumption about anything you do or don't believe. That's up to you, but I'm hoping to just introduce material for people to think about, debate, ask questions about, and so on. Secondly, everyone gets to contribute. So I'm going to do 2 presentations before the question and answer time. But in between those 2, we're going to have some discussion around the tables as well. So please, it would be wonderful if everyone on the tables, if you're happy to, could just say what you think at that point. At the same time, make sure everyone gets listened to as well. Really good if there's full respect for everyone, wherever they're coming from. As well. And then fourthly, have fun. It's okay to make each other laugh. It's okay to have a little bit of fun as we go as well. There'll be 2 presentations, a group discussion in the middle. Then you can fling all of your questions, or as much as time allows for, to me, to Sarah, and to Adrian. And then we will finish around about 8:30. You'll be off to go and enjoy some more cake. The cakes are absolutely wonderful here, by the way, tonight. Thank you so much for those who have provided those. But yeah, we've got this question that everyone asks at some point. If there's so much suffering in the world, is it really possible to believe that there is a good God out there? And actually, the problem of suffering is one of the biggest questions that there is in the world. It's also one of the most commonly asked questions. It doesn't surprise me at all that was top of the survey that we put out. And also, it's very commonly asked. It's also an unwelcome question, though, isn't it? The question of suffering. Don't we wish that humanity had never had to grapple with the problem of suffering? And yet, as Adrian said, every year there are yet more disasters and tragedies. The COVID pandemic, war in the Ukraine. There are so many other ongoing crises that just don't hit the news. Stuff going on at the moment in Yemen, in Ethiopia, and so on. There's rising poverty all around the world. And then more specific cases like Logan Mwambi, George Floyd, and so on and so on. Those are sadly just the most recent ones. But we can never get away from the problems of suffering and evil. Now, for some people, this is a philosophical issue, and a genuine one. They're trying to make sense of the world. How does the world fit together? What's suffering about? And that's a sincere and important question. But for many of us, it's also a deeply personal issue, isn't it? You're asking the question because of some experience that you've been through, or someone you love has been through, or someone you loved. For me personally, I would say I've been through many of the more common kinds of suffering: painful relationships, bullying, disappointment, unemployment, bereavement. I haven't had so far to face much of what you might call the darker kinds of suffering, but many people that I know and love really have. My wife in a long period of debilitating illness, a close friend whose wife left him for another man, friends who have been abused, even murdered. And I used to work among Burmese refugees, and among them, they had seen just unspeakable kinds of evil done by the military regime in Burma. And everyone here will have their own experience of suffering. So suffering, pain, evil, these are problems that we can't just set aside. But it is important to realise that these are not just questions for Christians. These are not just questions that Christians have to have an answer for. No, they challenge every single faith and worldview, including atheism, which people often say, I don't believe anything. Well, no, that's not true. Everyone has some beliefs. Every belief system has its own answers to these kind of questions, although people don't always realise this. So it's not just Christianity. The real question is whether any worldview can handle a problem as big as the problem of suffering. And so that's how we're going to look at this evening, actually. We're not just going to look at Christianity, we're going to look at a couple of other angles on it and see how other people from different angles answer the question of suffering. But 2 questions that we have to get from every worldview is this. what do they actually say about suffering? What do they actually say? Because sometimes people like to say, oh, I don't believe that, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that. Yeah, but what do you actually say from your own perspective? Really important to understand that. And then second, and this is especially important when it comes to suffering, where does it leave you? If you believe that belief system, where does it ultimately leave you? So that's really, really important, and we've got to explore that, and we could explore more, but we won't have time this evening. But then one other issue that I think it's really important to acknowledge before we go into these specific viewpoints is that there's a connection that we can't set aside, and it's this one. The connection between the problem of suffering and the problem of the human heart. Okay, now some suffering in the world comes through what we call natural causes, but far more derives from personal causes, moral causes, from evil actions for which humans are very obviously responsible. And so because moral evil stands behind so much of the suffering that we experience and we ask questions about, therefore we cannot separate the problem of suffering from the problem of the human heart. So those are just two things I always find it's helpful to say right at the beginning. Okay, let's get on to perspective one. What is it going to be? It's going to be Buddhism. Now, to some people that was going to be obvious. To some people that really wasn't going to be obvious. But let me say why Buddhism screams to be one of the perspectives that we look at. Buddhism is a philosophy and a way of life that takes the problem of suffering as its starting point. It starts with the problem of suffering, and then it centres on the problem of suffering throughout. So this is what Buddha said. I set forth only this, suffering and the end of suffering. In other words, suffering is the be-all and end-all of what I'm trying to work out. Buddhism is a whole philosophy built on the problem of suffering. Now, Buddha's journey to enlightenment began with this problem of suffering and his 4 famous encounters with an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a holy man, if you want to go and look into the details of that. And the goal that he set himself was to unravel the mystery of suffering. Now, fundamental to the Buddhist and other Eastern worldviews is the concept of karma and rebirth. Karma and rebirth. Karma is that cosmic law that everyone in the end will reap what they sow, whether in this life or the next. But you cannot escape karma. So here's an example of one of Buddha's quotes. So whether you have committed ill deeds or are committing them now, you will not escape suffering, even if you try to run away. No matter where you stay, there is no place that karma has not created. That's what the Buddha said. Everything is ruled by the law of karma. And so you've got to understand that, he would say. And then within that worldview, Buddha's teaching claims to answer the problem of suffering, and it's often summarised by what are called the 4 Noble Truths. And there's the basic principle at the heart of it is very simple. Okay, so 4 things that you have to acknowledge. Number 1 is the truth of suffering, dukkha. That just means suffering exists. Okay, I think everyone can understand that, not too complicated. Suffering exists. Secondly, now this is a really important one, is the truth of arising. And what this basically says is that all suffering is ultimately caused by what he calls tanha, which means thirst or craving or desire. Desire is the cause of all suffering, because if we didn't desire something, then we wouldn't be frustrated or hurt when something else happens. Everything comes ultimately from desire. And then the 3rd noble truth just follows on from that, the truth of cessation of suffering. It says, if we can deal with the cravings, then we can deal with the suffering. If we can bring the cravings, the desires, the thirsts to an end, make them cease, then the suffering's going to stop. And then there is the truth of the path, that there is what's called the noble eightfold path that helps you pursue that path towards dealing and ultimately ending your cravings. The noble path includes right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right mindfulness, which of course has become very popular today. Now, one other thing to say about Buddhism is the hope that it holds out. So it's very, very hard to do what Buddha did and what he called his disciples to do. But if you can finally make it, in Buddhism, it's called nirvana. Nirvana. And what this means is that you break free of being born again and born again and born again, reborn. But what nirvana interestingly means is it's the word that was used for snuffing out a candle. To be quenched or to be blown out. That's what nirvana means. That you are quenched, blown out. If you like, the fullest experience of detachment that is possible. And here's how I find this really striking. In the Dalai Lama's book, one of his books, he says a key principle, and this is how he puts the key principle in Buddhism: I will practice non-attachment to all the wonderful things of this life. Non-attachment to all the wonderful things, not the bad things, but to the wonderful things. That's the philosophy. And so Buddhism is built on the problem of suffering, and it actually offers, can you see the genius of it? Can you see the genius? It's really, really, really clever. It's really, really hard, but it's really, really clever. If you can find a way of dealing with your desires, setting them aside, then so many of the frustrations and hurts in your life are just going to be set aside. So it's very, very clever, but it's very, very hard. But of course it does come at a cost, doesn't it? I mean, what are the wonderful things of this life? The people we love. Very, very hard, isn't it? I mean, think of Claire and little Elena over there. If Claire's path to happiness and freedom was ultimately to detach herself from her love for Elena. But this is the logical path of Buddhism. Detach yourself even from the wonderful things of this life. And very strikingly, how it works out. One of the key Buddhist texts on grief and loss says this: the wise do not grieve. The wise do not grieve. So that's something of how Buddhism approaches the problem of suffering. Second perspective, atheism. Atheism. Believing God doesn't exist. And there are many people, increasing numbers, who would say today that that's what they believe. But within that, there are all sorts of different perspectives. Some people are more optimistic. They say, I don't believe in God, but I'm fairly sort of optimistic about having a good life. That would be people like Stephen Fry, A.C. Grayling, and so on. Others are more pessimistic. Say, well, if ultimately God doesn't exist, that leaves us in a pretty ultimately hopeless place. So people like John Gray more recently, or the great French existentialists Camus, Sartre, and so on, would be of that pessimistic view. But let's have a look at some of the things that they would say about suffering. Okay, now part of what they say about suffering just comes from what they say about life in general. Okay, so Stephen Fry did some videos with the British Humanist Association, kind of trying to explain what they believe. And this was one of the really important quotes from it. He was saying, when you're looking at life, the time to be happy is now. The time to be happy is now. And the way to find meaning in life is to get on and live it as fully and as well as we can. Now, that's a very sort of common and popular and positive philosophy today. You'd have to ask, was that easier before or after the pandemic? It's important to ask that, because that is one of the general principles there. But there are also more negative atheists. And an example would be a guy called John Gray, who wrote a book called Straw Dogs. And he, again, is just trying to work out what it logically means to live as someone who doesn't believe in God. And he says the same thing in some ways about meaning, but he's less optimistic. So here's one of his key quotes. As with other animals, some human lives are happy. Some are wretched. None has a meaning that lies beyond itself. And this is a really key thing with atheism. All the atheists say, you don't discover the meaning of your life. It's down to you to create it. You don't have a meaning beyond yourself. You have to create the meaning of your life. But of course, you have to get honest, don't you, as an atheist, about everything that goes on in the world. And here's a classic statement of it by Richard Dawkins about what he calls the lottery of life and how unfair the world is. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now that's just the logical, that's just being honest as an atheist, saying, life is just unfair, the world is unfair, but that's just how it is. That's just how it is. But of course, the tragedy of death is a huge part, isn't it, of the question of suffering. If nobody died, then it would be a very different kind of question, wouldn't it? But every atheist I've read essentially says the same thing in just slightly different ways. Death is sad, but it's just how things are. Death is sad, but it's how things are. So here's an example from Stephen Fry. Death is a natural part of life. It makes sense for us to try not to be afraid of it, but instead to come to terms with it. Then we can focus on finding meaning and purpose in the here and now, making the most of the one life that we know that we have. That's his wisdom that he offers when it comes to death. But it's very interesting to me that modern atheists haven't actually written much about suffering. A lot of this stuff that I have found, I've had to really delve very, very hard. For example, A.C. Grayling, his book, The God Argument, that kind of makes his case for atheism. Very, very hard to find any chapter in this that actually says what he really believes about suffering as an atheist. He says, he spends half of the book, the case against religion. He says everything he doesn't like, and, of course, we could add more to that. But actually what he believes as an atheist facing the problem of suffering, very, very hard. And actually when it comes to it, well, John Lennox calls a lot of modern atheists soft atheists, because he says they basically don't have the courage to really explore their beliefs to their logical conclusion. However, if you were around much in the 20th century and you liked reading around, you will know that there were people in the 20th century who really did, who wanted to take atheism to all of its logical conclusions. And one person was very well known, I think he was born in Wales, wasn't he? Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell wrote a remarkable essay called A Free Man's Worship. A Free Man's Worship. And, here's one of the quotes from it. He says, "United with his fellow men by the strongest of all ties, the free man finds that a new vision is with him always, shedding over every daily task the light of love." Now that sounds very positive, doesn't it? Okay, let me show you without the dots, okay, without the bits that I've cut out. Let me read the full thing. And these are the closing paragraphs of what he says about living in the world as an atheist. "United with his fellow men by the strongest of all ties, the tie of a common doom, the free man finds that a new vision is with him always, shedding over every daily task the light of love. The life of man is a long march through the night, surrounded by invisible forces, tortured by weariness and pain, towards a goal that few can hope to reach, and where none may tarry long. One by one, as they march, our comrades vanish from our sight, seized by the silent orders of omnipotent death." It's bleak, isn't it? It's bleak. He carries on. "Brief and powerless is man's life. On him and all his race, the slow sure doom falls pitiless and dark. Blind to good and evil, reckless of destruction, omnipotent matter rolls on in its relentless way. For man, condemned today to lose his dearest, tomorrow himself to pass through the gate of darkness, it remains only to cherish the lofty thoughts that ennoble his little day." It's bleak, isn't it? Really, really bleak. You see, as an atheist, Bertrand Russell talked about the beauty of tragedy, but he could offer no ultimate hope to anyone. The greatest hope would be the hope of a legacy that people would remember you and remember you positively, but no hope that you could actually be part of. And, and this one I end on before we go into group discussion. You discuss what you think about all of these things. But this is such a striking thing that John Paul Sartre said near the end of his life. He said, "Atheism is a cruel long-term business, and I believe I have gone through it to the end." Sartre and others tried to say, okay, I'm an atheist. What does that ultimately mean? And this is what he concluded. It's a cruel long-term business. Now, we're going to look what Christianity has to say next, but I just want to take a pause there, and I'd love you to go into your groups. Some of it may be completely new to you. You may need to ask someone on the table, what on earth was that about? But feel free to use this time to explain things to each other, to ask your questions, to say what you think about those things that have been said, and we'll come back together and look at Christianity in about 10-15 minutes' time.